It's time now for perspective, and over the past 50 years, world wildlife populations have declined by a whopping 69%. That's according to a report published last week by the World Wildlife Fund. It comes as global leaders are set to meet in early December for their biggest biodiversity conference in a decade, with the goal of agreeing to a new framework to protect the world's plants and animals. Joining me to talk about it is world-renowned scientist Paul Leadley, one of the main contributors to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Mr. Ledley, thank you so much for being with us here on France 24. Let's start with that latest report that I mentioned in the introduction. I imagine it's pretty simplistic to sum up the world wildlife loss with just one figure, but does it sort of give us a sense of where we're at?
Sure it does. It's an indicator that we've been following for a long time. And when that indicator goes down, it's really signaling that something's not going well for wildlife. So it's a really important indicator and one of many that we follow.
And have we reached sort of a point of no return when it comes to wildlife loss?
No. I think one has to be optimistic. We know that when we reduce the pressures on wildlife, and we saw some of that during COVID, when we leave them alone, many times, not always, then their populations can rebound.
And what parts of the world are most heavily impacted?
Well, that we know pretty clearly. So looking at that index, for example, we see that it's mostly in Southeast Asia and South America where it's going down the fastest. But also in Africa, there are serious problems. It's more stabilized in North America and in Europe.
And what are some of the main drivers of biodiversity loss?
Well, I think that that's really important to know that. And so from a terrestrial perspective, so on land, it's primarily agriculture and the things that's associated with agriculture. And in the oceans, it's primarily fishing. So the primary driver of that are our food systems. So how we gather food or grow food and how we eat.
Which is interesting because you might think that it would be climate change, but where does that factor in?
So climate change is a very important driver of biodiversity loss. And there are some ecosystems like coral reefs right now, which are primarily impacted by climate change. And that's going to become very, very serious in the next couple of decades. But it's going to be a much more important driver over the coming decades than it is now. We can begin to see climate change impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, but they're smaller than land use change or fishery impacts for the moment.
And one of the areas you study is how biodiversity impacts the overall ecosystem. So what are some of the wider implications of biodiversity loss?
So some of the big implications of biodiversity loss are that can affect what we get from natural ecosystems and from agricultural ecosystems. So I'll just take the example of pollinators. So we know that in Europe, there's a really big decline in insects, and many of those are pollinators. And those are really important for pollinating wild plants, but they're also really important for pollinating plants that we depend on for food. And so when we're having these really negative impacts on biodiversity, we're also having these really negative impacts on what we call ecosystem services. That is those things that we get from ecosystems.
Yeah, so farmers are sort of the driver, but they're also ultimately one of the victims.
Yes, in many cases, that's absolutely true.
And declining animal habitats also lead to a greater risk of human exposure to new infectious diseases. We thought about that a lot with the coronavirus. So is this a public health issue as well?
It's absolutely a public health issue. So we know as we go into tropical forests and begin doing deforestation that we're exposing ourselves to new viruses, new diseases. We also know in some cases when you destroy biodiversity, your biodiversity declines, it actually increases the viral load or the parasite load in animal populations, and so it makes it a higher risk for us. So yeah, there's a lot of health problems associated with biodiversity loss.
Okay, I do want to talk about solutions as well as problems. There's that crucial Global Biodiversity Conference coming up at the start of December in Montreal.
Yes.
Leaders are going to adopt a new Global Biodiversity Framework. Can you tell us what's currently in it and also what should be in it?
So there's lots of good things in it. I think the biggest question is, will countries actually adopt what's currently in it? So there's lots of good measures to act not only on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, things like land use change or overfishing or climate change. That's all in there. There's also things to act on those indirect drivers like agriculture and also our economy, so to get rid of subsidies that are really bad for biodiversity. Essentially, everything's in there. It just
Okay,
needs to be
that's good to
adopted
know.
with the ambitious goals that are there already.
And
If they actually do that, and then they actually implement it, we could actually be going to a much more positive impact on nature and people.
Okay, and in that case, how likely is it looking that it's going to get adopted, and what are some of the roadblocks you foresee?
So some of the biggest roadblocks have to do with things that are not related to the targets themselves, but related to other issues, and primarily around funding. So where should funding come from to put in place this extremely ambitious sets of targets and goals? And in particular, developing countries are looking towards developed countries to provide more funding to help protect biodiversity and adapt to climate change. And another big issue is around the sharing of genetic resources, where countries who are the source of lots of these genetic resources would like to be compensated financially for the use of those genetic resources.
And when you say genetic resources, what do you mean by that?
So what we have are now these big gene banks that pharmaceutical companies and other companies are using to make money off of. And many of those gene sequences come from developing countries. And they're saying, well, you got that information from where we are, where our biodiversity, and we ought to be able to get some of the profits from that.
And are there any countries that you're looking at specifically that you imagine are likely going to be a problem at this conference?
Oh, I don't think I want to get into naming names. Okay. I think there's quite a few of them. I think one of the biggest things that we're going to be confronted with is it's not the best time in history to be making international collaboration. And so I just hope that everybody goes there, all the countries go there with a very positive approach to this.
That's good. The opponents will reveal themselves in good time, I suppose.
Yep.
Finally, any real impact, of course, has to come at the structural level, which we've been talking about, but there is always this question about what we can do as individuals, things like changing our diets.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious if you, as a scientist, tend to make those kinds of decisions with climate change in mind.
Absolutely. So is that a personal question?
It is a personal question.
Yeah. So I try to do my best, but I certainly don't do enough. So I ride my bicycle to work. I don't eat or very little red meat, mostly fish and poultry. And we live in a wooden house. You know, we try and do all those kinds of things. But clearly, I travel too much in airplanes. I've tried to cut back on that quite a bit. I try and do my best, but probably it will require even deeper changes in my own personal behavior to really have enough of an impact.
All right, Paul Leadley, thank you so much for sharing all of your analysis with us. We'll be thinking about you when that biodiversity conference comes up. That was Paul Leadley, professor at Paris-Saclay University and a member of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.